you sitting comfortably, then we'll begin. Okay, well I'm going to have a small excursion this morning before we start off on Sixth Perfection proper, because I'm going to talk to you about a teaching I know some of you have heard me talk about before, which I think is actually the most important teaching in the whole of Buddhism. So let me lay it on the line. That's the most important teaching. Guess which one it is? Can anybody guess which one it is? What's the most important teaching? Come on, Anne, you must know. Eileen?
The 12 links?
Yes.
I thought it might be.
Dependent origination. Praticca samutpada. Yeah, it's the most important teaching in the whole of Buddhism. I remember last time I was at Leyland Conyers with everybody, I said, have you memorised the 12 links?
Also, John's coming. Make sure we get our heads around those 12 links.
Okay, so how are you doing?
Yes. Well, I find naming them fine. Living them, seeing them relating to life, I find harder. The obvious one is easy. Contact, grasping, craving. I find that easy because you do it all the time and you can see it so clearly in meditation. But I find the rest quite hard.
Right.
Fine in theory, but actually relating it to an activity.
You can see it. Don't worry about it. You'll see it.
Right.
If you do the sitting meditation that I've actually recommended to you doing on a regular basis, 45 minutes a day, then you are going to see it. You are going to see out of contact arises Vedana, which gives rise to craving, which gives rise to attachment, which gives rise to becoming. You will see it. There is no doubt. You will see what immediately happens when you get a sensation. Now, lest you think I'm drifting off the perfections, I'm not. Because actually, really, this is the content of what is going on in really understanding emptiness, i.e. the perfection of, usually translated as wisdom. But here I'm translating it properly as insight or understanding. And it's also part of the perfection of concentration as well, of dhyana. So we're not drifting off in the slightest. This is really the major content to it. Lest one think this is intellectual, it's not. It's not at all. It's a practical teaching. Buddha did not teach anything that wasn't practical. He was not interested in intellectual speculation. He was not interested in just kind of intellectual theories for the sake of them. What he was giving you was a minimal report on what's going on in your experience in terms of samsara. How you create this state of being for oneself, which we do at the drop of a hat. We create samsara. Remember that, we create it. Nobody else. Samsara does not come about other than the fact that we create it. In other words, we create the psychological conditions which give rise, because we're so good at it, at misery. Fun?
I said, oh my God.
Yeah. But I'm not hedging my bets here, because this is exactly what's going on. We create misery. If any of you are familiar with the Dhammapada, the Dhammapada, this classic little text, I know I quote this endless times at you, but the opening phrase is, mind is the forerunner of all things. Mind is the forerunner of all things. With an unhappy mind, then unhappiness will follow you, like it says the shadow follows the wheels of a cart, and the ox follows the cart. So, with a happy mind, completely different world. Two worlds, you've got a choice. Which one do you like? Unhappy one or a happy one? Yes. And also, pardon?
It can't be that simple.
It is. It is. It's that simple and that difficult in its simplicity. Actually, there's nothing in it. We look at the vast edifice of Buddhisms, because really that's what we're talking about, because there are so many Buddhisms. But when you actually boil the teachings down, no matter what the tradition is, it's actually quite simplistic. You're having to go through complex convolutions to get back to the simple. And there's a very good reason for this. And I always liken it. Actually, in one of the texts, the Buddha says, who is going to untangle the tangle? And the tangle is you, this tangle and knot that you are. And that's a very good analogy, because if you think about it, if you've actually got a piece of string or a shoelace or something and you've knotted it up, in such a way that you can't get it undone, what do you have to do? No. If you're not being brutal, if you're not being brutal, what you do is you go in reverse order, don't you? You have to trace it backwards in order to untangle it. Yeah, I still want to end up with a nice piece of shoelace or something at the end of it. You know, so you have to go backwards. You untangle the tangle that you're involved in. And that's why the seeming complexity is because we're going through this backward motion to untangle the knot that we're in. And so, in a way, it's a simple, but it's a complex procedure, as you've often tried to do it. You know, when you've got a really tangled up piece of string, sometimes you feel like going, like this, throwing it away and not wanting to untangle it. But if you have, let's use that word? Patience, that's right. If you have patience, then you can untangle it. Yeah. And that's what's involved in this. And so really all the Buddha is giving you is teachings which are there to help you untangle the knot that you're in. Now, the teaching of dependent origination, I didn't bring it with me because I couldn't carry it, but in something called the Digha Nikaya, which is actually the long discourses of the Buddha, there's something called the Mahanidana Sutta. And the Mahanidana Sutta is the Buddha's main discourse on the 12 links of dependent origination. Actually, it's not 12 in this discourse, it's 9. He's not attached to any numbers. You know, he doesn't really care, it's an explanatory mechanism, that's all. So again, shows you one thing, don't get hooked on models, because the Buddha changes them whenever he wants to. You know, sometimes he'll talk about 6 links, sometimes he'll talk about 9 links, sometimes he'll talk about 12 links. He'll give you any number of varieties just to get the message across of what's going on. So there's no one particular model. The 12 is just the most, you know, it's the one that gives you obviously the more complex version of it. But he says in this particular sutta, opening part of the sutta, I love the opening part of this sutta because it's quite funny actually in the original Pali. Because the Ananda, who's like the fall guy, who lives around the Buddha, he's his attendant. Ananda goes up to the Buddha one day and says, basically, I'm paraphrasing it, it's much more elegant than the Pali, but he goes, dependent origination, work that one out, know that. And the Buddha sort of stands back horrified and goes, Ananda, think again. This teaching is profound. And when the Buddha says profound, he means really, really, really difficult. The word profound covers a multitude of sins here. And so when he says profound, it means really, 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 really difficult. Not difficult to understand, because that's actually the level that Ananda is at. He's understood it, he hasn't experienced it. Experiencing dependent origination is actually to experience, in a way, liberation from samsara. You know, once you understand the mechanism of what's going on and how we build this up, you know, how we build up the samsaric world, all of the paramatars, all of the perfections are there to help us to undermine the habitual tendencies which we have to create this world which, you know, is samsaric, and as its feeling tone, its basic feeling tone, it has dukkha as its main, you know, not that it's totally devoid of joy and fun and things like that, but you know, because we are attached to holding on to them, even the joys and the fun come up as dukkha. You know, because they disappear, don't they? You know, we can't perpetually hold on to them. In fact, trying to hold on to them, to prolong them, actually causes us a lot of misery, a lot of anguish. You know, because things are transitory. Everything is transitory. You know, and we forget that at our own, you know, cost, really. And we are transitory, and everything around us is transitory, and our minds are transitory, and you know, we look at the human constructions and they are transitory, and even the Himalaya continue to rise about half an inch a year. You know, so nothing is remaining the same, nothing remains still whatsoever. And we know, as the Tibetans are really, you know, actually a culture which actually really, really does take this on board, knows that death is actually an intrinsic part of everything. You know, an intrinsic part of everything that is something we find very, very difficult to take on board. I often joke about this, and again, forgive me for those who've heard me say it a number of times before, but what happens is something like this. We hear this teaching on death and we go, oh yes, one knows one is going to die. that means everyone, but not me.
The 12 links come into play in the bardo, i.e. grasping for another existence, or...
Yeah, bardo. Yeah, you grasp after another existence, that's right. So we're always grasping. The 12 links are always there in any form of samsaric existence. Now actually you could, as Anne almost said really, boil down the most important part of the linkages to the complex, which starts off with with contact, which gives rise to feeling, sparsha to vedana, to trishna, to craving, to upadana, which is attachment, and then to bhava, continued existence, or becoming as it's often translated. Coming round then of course to birth, old age and death again. Now there's complex ways of understanding this, which is actually to do with our psychology, and a lot of the traditions make this very, very clear, that it's a psychological thing as much as a literal thing, a metaphysical theory. So that we are going through this all the time. Actually, we are going through the 12 links of independent origination or dependent origination every moment. All 12 links are coming into play every moment. Aren't we clever?
How do the birth, old age and death come into play all the time?
Because every time a moment is being born, which is declining, is disintegrating and then falls away. Okay? So no matter what the psychological state is that comes into being, it's going to decline. Remember the phrase I was using last night in relation to meditation. It arises, it passes away.
But also happening in nirvana as well then, if we're in nirvana.
Of course it is. Nirvana-ing is, yes. Nirvana-ing is. I mean, nirvana-ing is nothing other than the living. For those who know anything about the Zen tradition, the Dogen says actually awakening within the Soto Zen tradition is nothing other than living impermanence. Truly living impermanence. So the awakened one, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, is living impermanence at such a level that you can be, in a sense, as German poet Rilke says, in this world forever taking leave. We can actually be in this world doing that, taking leave of everything, because that's what's happening. Yet we don't. And hence the reason why 12 links, in a sense, creates much more of a solid entity, which we perceive. In other words, we create a world out of the 12 links and call it the world, and isn't it impossible for it to change? Well, it's changing all the time.
With living impermanence, then you would have total equanimity, I assume.
If you live
there
it.
all the time, and whatever wouldn't throw you, or
that's right. Yeah. I mean, there's a very fun, again, it's almost amusing incident in the sutta material, and it's in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, and if you haven't read these, they're really worth reading. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, again, poor old Ananda again, Ananda, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta is a sutta about the Buddha's death. It's about the time before, leading up to the events surrounding the Buddha's death. And the Buddha is dying at this particular stage after he's eaten this basically rotten meat, and he has food poisoning and all the rest of it, and he's dying. And Ananda is kind of leaning against the doorpost of a hut, weeping and wailing about the Buddha's demise, and the Buddha says, "Ananda, have you actually been listening to me? Haven't I said through the whole of my teaching career for 45 years that everything that is born will die?" And it's almost as simple as that. In other words, what really the Buddha is trying to indicate for most of us is it's not difficult to understand. It's just we just don't get it most of the time. We just don't get what life is about most of the time. And it's almost as simple as that. As I say, 12 links of dependent origination are not complex, actually. You can see them in operation, but the difficulty is seeing them in the operation. You know? So where do we start? Well, we start with avidya, which is translated as ignorance. But only here, I'm only going to go spend a little bit of time with this but I do think it's important, and I think it's important in relationship to the paramatars, and then we'll come to the paramatars. But if we take avidya, what is avidya? Well, avidya is ignorance, but here in its in its proper sense of ignorance in English. Ignorance in English means to overlook something, to literally ignore. You know, it has the same root as ignore. So when we have this state of ignorance, not only is it a case of not knowing, which is implied by the term ignorance, but it's actually not wanting to know. You know? It actually has that positive content to it, if you like. It's an active not wanting to know. And you see this. I mean, there's a term that we use in Western psychotherapists, and that's called denial. Yeah. That actually we live in denial of an awful lot of the facts about life. Yeah. And impermanence is a very good one of those, isn't it? Because actually, what we're saying is, and it's the crux of the problem in many senses. Because remember, again, I outlined it to you last night. What is the content of the waking? Well, understanding how dukkha arises, understanding anicca, or anitya, impermanence, and understanding not self. Yeah. Now, actually, psychologically, you, I, and everybody are looking for some form of security. And where do we look for security? We look for it in a degree of permanence. That's where we look for it. Now, a lot of us will look at perhaps the grosser events of our life and go, oh yes, they're impermanent. I can accept that. But subtly, psychologically, we don't want things to change. See? We don't actually want them to change, do we? You don't want, this other person to change, who you perhaps have a relationship with. You don't want them to change. You want them to remain the same. You want them to be like you. Like a lot of the time. And you don't want them, you want you. Again, it comes back to me, doesn't it? I was talking about last night. Yeah. Everywhere you go, there you are. Yeah. That's the situation that we find yourself in. But we're looking, in other words, and it might not be on this grosser level of looking for big securities in the world, but we look more and more subtly for something that isn't going to change. And that is why, it's not just an easy kind of sign-up affirmation to the facts of impermanence, because perhaps most of us will take on board to a degree that there is, that death is our actuality, is our, is the end result of living. That's, as I think Woody Allen says, that death is a terminal illness, life is a terminal illness. Only Woody Allen could say that. That's the way you're going, and there's an inevitability to that, which actually we cannot avoid. We cannot avoid it. I don't know if I was watching, actually, I rewatched it again quite recently, and some of you might have seen it. There was about a year or so, might even been a couple of years ago, there was a programme of all of these films that were made over 100 years ago, actually in this sort of locality, in this area. I think it was cut out of a sort of early cinematographer who was living in Blackburn. And he took all photographs, and some of the film was 109 years old, of living people, and you see them, and there was somebody actually on there looking at his great-grandfather playing football. Yeah, no, rugby, it wasn't football, it was playing rugby and that, and you're saying you couldn't believe it because they had the shorts held up with a belt. Yeah. And things like that. But that's not the point of what I want to say. When I looked at this, you realise that everybody, you looked absolutely everything that was going on in those films, and they looked really animated, they're living people, some of the earliest films around of just common people of 109 years ago, and everybody's dead.
Yeah.
Not one person is alive. You're looking at a whole load of ghosts, in a way. That's what we're doing when we look at these old films like that. And that really brings it home if you actually reflect on things like that when you do it. You look at these old films, perhaps of 60 odd years ago, and the majority of the people have now disappeared who are imaged in those films. So it's worth reflecting on that, because our drive towards looking for some degree of permanence, no matter how subtle, is very great, and don't ever underestimate it within ourselves. Which is why in the final stages even of the Bodhisattva path, that actually you're finally relinquishing this subtle grasping, as they would call it. Your subtle grasping is exactly that, subtle. You don't notice it most of the time. All you recognize is a psychological instability about living in this world and not having that security. So avidya is this positive thing, which is positively not wanting to know. I don't want to know. And actually avidya has a content. The content is called the asavas in Pali and Sanskrit, or ashravas in Sanskrit. And there are basically 4 of them. The first one is avidya itself, called avidyasava, or avidyashrava. Then there is
You haven't said what that word means.
avidya.
Yeah.
Yeah, ignorance.
Ignorance.
Yeah. So that's the first one. And everything else unpacks from that. I haven't said what the word ashrava means, actually.
No.
The word there's no good translation of it, which is why I've possibly left it slightly like this. But I'll have a go. Actually, often you'll find it translated in the books as something like outflows. The most common one is cankers. As a colleague of mine at Bristol University once said, the only thing he knew had cankers was dog's ears and roses. So he didn't think it was a terribly good translation. Those are the 2 most common ones. Actually, the word literally, ashrava or asava, literally means effluent. Yeah, it's not very nice, is it? Yeah. But it's really trying to get at something. In other words, this is what outflow is not bad, but it's only half the story, because it's actually what is pouring out of us in our ordinary existence. It's flowing out of us. I'm sorry at this time and then, it's still, well, it's not too early, so I don't mind actually. I'm going to present you with an unpleasant image. Incontinence. Because that is what it is. We are incontinent with our psychological propensity to create dukkha and to pour out certain things onto the world. That's what we're doing. And we do this continuously. So we pour out our ignorance on the world and call it wisdom, often. We pour out the next one, which is kamasava, or kamashrava, which is kama. Everybody knows this one, kind of Kama Sutra. Yeah, it means sensuality. It's the desire for sensual things. The desire for sensual goodies, pleasures, and everything. Our Western world is full of them, isn't it? So much of the Western world is given over to amusing itself to death. That's all we do. Just continuously amusing ourselves all the way up. We talk about one of the big things, adolescents these days getting bored. Oh, I'm bored. There's only a world out there to look at and to be in. Entertain me. It's very much that sort of thing, and actually I think that has grown. That has grown a lot. There's this wanting to be distracted continuously. I was kind of having a chat with Anne last night before we came down here, and one of the things I was saying about Western society is virtually everybody in Western society has attention deficit disorder. Virtually everybody. Now, okay, not clinically certifiable, but most people have it. The ability to concentrate is getting less and less and less. Hence the reason for the fast editing on things like films and television programs. If you go back, if you've got any videos of something you possibly recorded many, many years ago, look how slow it was, comparatively. I still continue to show a documentary which I recorded, in fact there's 2. There's one which was recorded in 1978 and one was recorded in the late 80s. You would never get anything like these. Both documentaries on Buddhism I show to my students at university. You would never get anything, because they are so factually accurate and actually very slow in unfolding. But you just wouldn't get anything like that now. The paucity of what's going on in terms of information conveyal is extremely quick. It's fast. There's no dwelling with it. Yeah. And it says also a lot about our education system, but don't get me on that one. So, Karmasava is this desire to be entertained a lot of the time, sensual. And think about it. Well, have a hard day at work, have a hard day, you know, whatever you're doing, have a difficult day. What do? You want to comfort yourself. And you usually run towards some sort of sensual pleasure in comforting yourself. Often people run and switch the television on, watch the soap, or whatever, or chocolate or alcohol or whatever the treat is. It's all sensuality from this point of view. Now, there's nothing wrong with sensuality, but it becomes something we're deeply, deeply craving continuously and attached to. In other words, it becomes a substitute for life. That is all part of avidya as well. Then there is something called bhavasava, and you're going to see this again as we go through. Bhavasava, bhava means the desire to be, the desire to want continued existence, the desire to be something in this world. All of us want to be something. Big thing. Look again at our culture. I mean, let's stick within this culture. I mean, I can talk about Tibetan cultures and Asian culture, but we're here. Look at our culture. It's culture of celebrity. Lots of celebrities who can't do anything. And everybody wants to be a celebrity. Now, I'm overplaying it again, so please forgive me, but I'm trying to make a point here. Is everybody wants to be something without effort.
We want to be as well, what's known as Hazrat, their intelligence, their good looks, their abilities. And therefore we grasp at these that they have and try to apply in our life, which isn't natural to us.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. We want, often actually, you see this in the cult of personalities when, particularly youngsters and that get involved in cult of personality and they want to be like their hero. They actually don't want to be themselves, they want to be like their hero. And all of this is going on. This is the desire to be in a particular way, and it kind of goes from the desire to be forever. There's always joke about this and say that's you on a good day. And you want to project yourself into the future. You want the things to go on in some way or another. But it's often this desire to be something. I mean, even if we haven't got this idea of continued existence or any of that form, we want to be something in this world. And actually think about it. Emptiness is saying actually the desire to be something rather than nothing, which is what you are. Because actually, emptiness is no thingness. You're nothing. But it doesn't mean you're nothing, but you're no thing. You cannot turn yourself into an object in this way. So that's involved in that. And then, we're coming to the last one, don't worry about it. This is the negative news. Then basically, the other one is called Ditasava. And this just means you're full of opinions.
Sorry, what was the first word for opinion?
It's the actual word in Pali and Sanskrit is diti, or ditasava, or ashrava. Diti means basically habit, view, or opinion. And what we're really saying is that not only are you ignorant, desirous of loads of sensual things, really want to be something in this world, but you're also full of opinions as well. Everybody's full of opinions. Where do you get your opinions from? Most of us don't know. They certainly haven't been thought out or viewed with insight or wisdom. A lot of them are prejudicial. They come out of media, they come out of social conditioning, they come out of class, language, background, everything else. But all of us have it. We all have these opinions. I'm a great eavesdropper when I'm on trains and things like that, because I do a lot of travelling doing this sort of stuff. And just hear, opinionatedness, that's all it is, going on in conversation. Yeah, it's just mainly opinions being swapped around. A lot of them, unfortunately, particularly again in our culture, are derived from things like tabloid press. Yeah. Yeah, so, in other words, where is the person in that opinion? Now, in a way, that's not a terribly good start, is it? Because that's where we find ourselves. In every moment, we find ourselves full of ignorance, full of sensuality, full of wanting to be something, and damn well opinionated. That's this moment. As you sit here, on your cushion. That's us. Yeah. That toys are us. I think opinions are us. In this way. And so that's the first link. Right here in this moment. And that gives rise to the next link. In other words, dependent on all of that, you thought ignorance was easy, didn't you? That it was simple. It isn't. Out of all of that, then arises sanskaras or sankharas. Sanskaras, which are, I'll give you a technical translation for it, karmic formations, but actually is really, again, putting a common English word on it, habit. That's what arises out of it. So out of all of that nexus of what composes avidya or ignorance, then arises a whole set of unwholesome habits of being in this world. Because if I'm driven by those four things, what's going to arise? Well, pretty well unwholesomeness. Because that's what I'm demanding of the world. And we've got to remember as well, and I always say, well, it's no reason to think why it's written into the contract of life. We want the world to give us something. Have you ever noticed it doesn't? You want the world to be in a particular way, and it's not. It's not for us, the world. It does what it does. And this phrase that's used in Dzogchen, which we find extremely difficult to see, which is it's perfect as it is. It doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory in this world, but it means it can't be any other way. That's the way it is. Now, lest one think that's a cause for apathy, I'll deal with that later, because it isn't meant to be. But it is as it is, and we have to deal with it as it is. In other words, we can't deal with it out of an idealized state. And so actually a lot of what is represented in avidya and the habit formations that we're doing is wanting the world to mould itself into a way that was malleable for us. And it doesn't do that most of the time. So if you ever look at the Tibetan Wheel of Life, which I'm sure you all have, and can obviously remember this one, and you look at the images around the edge, which represent the 12 links of dependent origination, then the sanskaras are represented by a potter moulding pots. It moulds them up and collapses them down. So actually our lives are dependent on the way that we mould it through our habit formations. So either it's wholesome habits or unwholesome habits. And if they're unwholesome, well, we add something to the world. It's called dukkha. Don't look so serious. We keep on adding dukkha. Remember what I was saying last night with dukkha producing machines? Drop of a hat will do it. That's what we're doing. And that, remember, that is the problem. I mean, the Buddha says I only teach two things. I teach dukkha and its overcoming. That's all I teach. So it's very, very practically oriented. Now, dukkha, bear in mind what I was saying last night. I'm kind of reminding you, and I'll do this throughout the weekend. Dukkha is what we psychologically add to events. Think of it in terms of an analogy. Here, you can have a toothache, and toothache can become misery really easily. I'm not talking about tragedies or anything like that. I'm just talking about a common physiological arising that happens to everybody at some point in time, usually. Something like a toothache. What happens when you've got a toothache? It takes over your whole mind, usually, doesn't it? And if it's a cavity or something like that, people keep sticking their tongue in it. In a way, analogously, that's what we're doing in life. You take an event, which is a happening that happens in life, and you focus the mind on it and keep going, poking it, in this way. That's what we do, and we make it even more painful. So in other words, we add misery to pain. Now, the only reason for saying all this is because you don't have to. It's just to point out that we don't have to keep on doing this. There is another way of being. And actually, dukkha is this psychological additive that doesn't have to be there in life. We don't have to have it. We don't have to create misery out of disasters. We don't have to create misery out of physiological pain. There are ways of holding it in a different way that isn't, in other words, subject to this magnifying glance, gaze, whatever you call it, of the mind, which is actually magnifying out, generally out of all proportion, usually to the actual event. So dukkha is an additive to life. In this age of increasing awareness about additives, how do you like life, with an additive or without? Because that's what we're doing, we're adding continuously to these events. And I know, again, I'm reminding you sometimes of what I've said before in previous times I've been up here, but the Buddha makes this very clear, or is made very clear in one particular sutta in the Pali Canon. For example, where the Buddha is walking along a road, it's called the Sutta of the Stone Splinter in the Sangyutta Nikaya, Connected Discourses. And he's walking along the road, and he treads on a shard of stone, because you didn't wear stuff on your feet in those days. 2,500 years ago, and particularly not if you're a renouncer in that tradition. A shard of stone penetrates the Buddha's foot, goes straight into his foot. And there's kind of reasons why this happens, but it says in the text, this causes the Buddha immense pain, and then adds in parenthesis, but no dukkha. In other words, you can have pain without dukkha.
I suppose it's an acceptance of it. This is what's happening. I've got toothache, or I've got something in my foot.
That's right. Well, you can imagine the ordinary person, can't you, walking along, getting a shard of stone in their foot. Why me? Why not the guy in front or the one behind? Why me?
That's, as you said, that's how it is.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful line.
It's as it is. Yeah. As it is. You have the piece of stone in your foot. Yeah, that's as it is. But then all that other stuff kicks in, which happens for most of us, doesn't it? When we get ill and everything else, or when we have something happen to us in our lives, and you go, why me? As if you're kind of exempt. You've got an exemption certificate from things happening to you. When you're stuck in a traffic jam, what are you thinking of? Let's talk about something really ordinary. Something stuck in a traffic jam, or your train doesn't run on time and things like that. You're railing about it. You don't sit back and relax, do you? It's that state of dis-ease which becomes disease here, that we're all in. Because we expect the trains to run on time, the car to get me to A to B at exactly the time I want to be there. We expect, again, the world to be for us and it to run exactly for us. As a perfect antidote to that, I suggest going to India. It's got better over the years, but it still doesn't run quite on time and the way things are supposed to run. I'll give you a little anecdote just to liven things up a little bit at this point. I remember one stage, and some of you might have heard me say this, but I was living in Delhi, and a guy came into India for the first time, never been to India before, and he came from Zurich in Switzerland. Switzerland, perfectly clean, everything runs on time, it's a place of clockwork and banks, and that day 3, poor old George, who came in from Switzerland, was having a nervous breakdown. He was having his terribly, terribly nervous breakdown. He was getting, and at the centre where I was staying at the time, we said to him, look George, don't worry, we'll get you on a train up to, because Delhi's chaos anyway, at the best of times. We'll get you on a train up to the mountains and you'll be up there with the Tibetans and it's nice and quiet and it's nice and peaceful comparatively to down here. So we got him down to New Delhi, we booked his train, an overnight sleep at Peakock, which is the nearest you can get to Dharamsala. And we even took him down to the station. And I don't know if any of you have been to India, but on all the trains had this list of who's in what compartments and things like that. And we found the right sleeping compartment with his name on it, put him into the first class sleeper, and stood on the platform waving him goodbye as the train started out, and the train pulled out and left the carriage behind.
But you're all through to it.
We had to stop ourselves. I must admit. It was like.
How did George react?
George flew back to Switzerland 2 days later.
Was the plane on time?
I think it was actually, but
It didn't the propeller behind.
in other words, the world does not work for us. You know, now that's again, it's a very extreme example, I know, and it doesn't often happen in this country in exactly the same way. But you know, why not expect the unexpected? You know, why not expect the unexpected? We don't, though, do we? We expect again things to have a degree, and this is coming right back, a degree of permanency. Yeah, and I'm not saying permanency has to be in terms of stability of a thing not changing, but that we look for even permanency in structure. Stability, security, you know. I get on my train and I know it's going to be there on time. How do you know? What are all the contingencies that can happen to stop you from getting there on time? And these are just very mundane examples. I'm sure you can think of ones in your own life where you're projecting into the future. You're projecting the outcome so much that when something goes wrong, you really get upset about it when it doesn't actually happen. And that's a habit. That's where I was coming to. That's a habit. Yeah. Isn't it? We do this continuously, habitually project into the future and expect the world to be in the form of our projection. Yeah. I mean, honestly, a lot of people who don't go to India, as I say, not so bad now as it used to be, but a lot of people from the West who go to India and actually travel by the local transport as opposed to going on air-conditioned buses and tours and things like that, find that, you know, things do not happen in the same way. You know? Things don't happen in the same way. All sorts of stuff happens there. You know, I was even on a bus once coming back from Ladakh into Kashmir, which had its engine stolen overnight. You know? And things like that. You know, so we get this very, very false impression, is what I'm saying, is that the world works with a degree of security and stability. You know, things are becoming much, much, much more uncertain. You know, we're moving into...
Didn't expect the world to be like that. Nobody would have laughed there, would they? That there was no engine. That's the way it is.
That's the way it is.
What's humorous about that? So there's no the engine.
Yeah.
That's how it is. So the train is late,
Mm.
and they left the carriage behind.
Mm.
So why did we laugh? That's how it is.
That's how it is.
But the laughter is because we expect it.
Yeah, because we expect...
Expect it to be right. It's
It
humorous.
goes against our normal projections about the way things are. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it is humorous because of that reason, because we have this idea that trains run on time and buses don't have their engines stolen. Yeah. Yeah.
The jokes as well. You listen to a joke,
Yeah.
and the ending's funny because it isn't what you expect.
Yeah, that's right.
It isn't as it is.
I remember when I was at the when I was living at the monastery in Gandin, in South India, and there was very little theft on these Tibetan settlements, and generally theft was by Indians. But they couldn't believe it. We came out one morning, and somebody had stolen the gong. And this gong was like this, you know, it was kind of huge. It was absolutely enormous, bronze gong. And all the Tibetan monks were just collapsed around with laughter, imagining these Indians struggling through the jungle with this gong. So I used to say, gong but not forgotten. Because again, it was completely unexpected. But you know, the fact you can laugh about it is saying, it is as it is. That's the way it is. Yeah, and I'm deliberately making a point of doing this with you because humour is a big part of this practice. It's a huge part of this practice. We can become terribly serious and pious about it, and this is not what it's about. You know, particularly if you've ever lived with Tibetans and Asian cultures, not so much Burmese and that because they have the kind of very serious demeanour, but if you live with certain cultures, Asian cultures, you find there's a lot of humour all the time about, you could actually teach the whole of the Dharma through jokes. Yeah, basically, through a series of jokes. Pardon? No, what would you have? The monk walked into a chai house, I think would be the closest to. But anyway, that's beside the point. Now the serious point I'm trying to make is that we're moulding and habitually forming all the time through unwholesome states of mind, coming through from those opinions, coming through from our sensual desires, coming through from our desire to be, and our absolutely not knowing and not wanting to know about this world. Well, is it surprising we're in the mess we are? Yeah? Is it surprising? Again, that's almost, well, first stage, accept it as it is. That is where we are. So there's no kind of questions of where did all that come from in the first place. There's no kind of questions of origin there. You know, where did the avidya come from? Where did the, everything else follows from that in a sense. And the first primary question about where does the avidya come from, forget it. Don't ask that question. Deal with what you've got, because that's what you've got. So we're here in this world with avidya, so we have to deal with it. And we have to deal with its immediate outcomes, which are our habitual formations. Now, lest we think habits remain the same, of course they don't. Yeah. But we do think habits are us, don't we? We do think they are. Again, I'm just making a serious point here. You will find that if anybody ever says, you've got this really irritating habit, if somebody says that to you, you go, oh, that's the way I am. Yeah, you'll get terribly defensive about it and often feel very hurt, actually, if somebody questions a habit that you have because you think it's you. Yeah. You actually think it is you. So what we're doing is, in fact, through awareness of dependent origination and eventually the development of the perfections, is we're loosening up the stranglehold that these things have on us. I mean, let's face it. Most of us will not say, if somebody criticises a habit, will not say, well, yeah, I know I have this habit, it's slightly irritating, but who cares? It kind of came in, I don't really hold it up. We don't say things like that. Go, what do you mean? You're more likely to take a much more defensive role about it than you are to take a kind of, well, it's just something I could change, but at this moment I haven't dealt with it, and things like that. People go into therapy for this, don't they? To actually deal with the hurt they feel sometimes with things like being attacked about habit formations and that. Now, the habit will not remain the same because it's always being modified, of course, in relationship to the world. But there is a tendency for something within it to create the same energetics. And what I mean by that is your habit formations tend to create similar circumstances and similar problems in your life. So, in traditional Buddhism, of course, you've spent, come on, this is why it's so difficult, you have spent lifetimes developing these habits. Yeah. Even if you don't want to go down that road, because it's too big a road to go down in terms of mind encompassing it, then you have to say to yourself, well, I've spent a lifetime getting to this point in my life with all these habits and these ways of doing things. That is why they're so difficult to deal with a lot of the time. Now, because of that, in having developed these habits, and actually probably some of the habits we developed had a very good use initially, when we first started to develop them. But of course what we do is we, in a sense, rarefy them. We actually hold on to them and think they're applicable in lots and lots and lots of different situations to which they're now no longer applicable. So it might have been, for example, self-protection mechanism, all sorts of things that we do to help ourselves, but then gets, for example, into a form which cuts us off from others. You might have had some particular trauma or some particular hurt in the past to which this was a response, and it's become solidified now to a degree, and which now cuts us off from others and means I can't enter into real relationship with people after a while. So, kind of scenario I'm trying to present to you is if you, and again, you all mostly have heard me say this, if you have this feeling that you're making the same kind of mistakes you're making 5, perhaps 10, even longer years ago, you probably are. Because it's the return of the same. You know, sounds like a movie, doesn't it? The return of the same. But it's coming back again because it's creating similar energetics and similar conditions for us to feel this kind of stuckness often. Yeah, that is habit formations. That's the sanskaras.
When you're talking about this, though, isn't a lot of our sort of samsaric way, ignorance and all that, it's very culturally conditioned as well.
Yeah.
Because clearly we, we're conditioned in a way to expect that the trains, give or take 5 minutes here in England, will run more or less on time.
That's right.
If we're in Zurich, we would expect they'll be bang straight on time.
Yeah.
If we're in India, we would expect maybe it'll be a day or two late or whatever.
That's right.
So we are conditioned that way.
Yeah.
Very strongly, and so then it becomes expectation, and then the world doesn't quite run the way we want it to because the train in England is half an hour late.
That's right.
So I guess so that's one thing, but the other thing is that do you find it perhaps easier in some cultural contexts to become more at ease with the way things are? You know what I mean? Whereas if things are very spontaneous in India and Africa, different places, then sometimes it's easier just to loosen up and say, well, we'll see what happens today. Whereas if you're here and everything's running according to clockwork, you develop that expectation so that when something happens, you are then thrown.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
I do indeed. And I think that this is, in a way, you're pointing to the degree of the enormity of the task, because not only do we have cultural conditioning, which is a huge part, as you're absolutely rightly saying, it's an enormous part of what we do, and there's also linguistic conditioning too. We condition through our language. And different languages divide up the world incredibly differently. Then we have our personal conditioning, which is the conditioning we receive through parents, through social class, social strata, sex, all the conditionings around those. Boys do this and girls don't do that, and girls don't do that and boys do this, and things like that, which isn't as bad as it used to be, but it's still there. It's still there, and again, it varies from culture to culture. That's all enculturated too, and all that stuff. Our individual conditioned responses to the things that happen. Now, what we're ultimately saying is, actually, ultimately, you can't change the social conditioning of your culture. You can't change it, but what we can do is come into a different relationship with it. So when the trains run on time, fine. When they don't run on time, fine. So in other words, you have a degree of relaxation about how it is. Because it's actually, remember what the Buddha's phrase is usually being with the way things actually are. This is what the Buddha is saying. Be with them the way they actually are, not the way you would like them to be. We might all like them to be different. I'd love the world to be different than the way it is at the moment, but it's not the way it is. The way it is riven with strife and all the sorts of things that we're seeing, some of the horrific things that are going on in the world.
Your mindfulness from last night comes into it.
Very much.
If you're mindful of this very moment, you're accepting it
Exactly as it is.
If you're
That's right.
mindful that you're standing on the station and the train hasn't come,
Yes.
then you're accepting it in that moment, aren't
Yeah,
you?
that's absolutely right. The good thing about being in other cultures from time to time is actually to challenge the ways, or other cultures can reflect back to you your own conditioning from time to time. I always remember a very good example. This was in my very early days, in 1971, 1972. And I was taking this Tibetan across London, and I'd been living in London at that point, and his name was Gonzarumsho. And I always remember I'd kind of completely relaxed with Tibetans and things like that, and felt like I'd dropped a lot of things. Complete nonsense. Got into London, what did I see? Saw the tube down at the bottom, went herring down the escalator, and he nonchalantly strolled down after me. By which time the tube train had pulled out, and it was me kind of going like this on the platform. I always remember this really strongly because it was, and he just said one thing to me. He said, "I've noticed this about the trains in London. One train goes and another comes." I mean, it was just a wonderful antidote to that kind of must get it, you know, must go to it. Yeah. And I think that kind of reflecting back from another culture where things don't happen quite like that, you know, actually is very useful from time to time. But the ability really is the ability to be with whatever is. You know, as I say, you know, whether it's there or it isn't. You know, and I'm obviously giving you a very practical, mundane example, but you know, whatever is arising with your life, you've got to be with it. You know, whatever is arising, let's put it very practically again in terms of your meditational practice, whatever is arising in your meditation practice, be with it, don't deny it. Don't repress it, don't run away from it. Look at it, acknowledge it, give it a wave. You know, say hello to whatever is arising. And that includes the good stuff, and that includes what we would normally count as the negative stuff. You know, what you're doing is familiarizing yourself with what is. You know, if there is a feeling of anger or irritation or boredom or that arising in your mind, it's arising in your mind. So be with it. Have a look at it. Say hello. You know, and let it go. Because it will go. It will change. Yeah. So this is, you know, again, coming back to the mindfulness, because the mindfulness in training ourselves towards whatever is arising, and remember I was saying last night, not taking too seriously what is arising, you know, because you have an angry thought, because you have a thought of sometimes even positively wanting to murder somebody, doesn't make you a bad person, you know, because we're not what we think. You know, the thoughts are just adventitious, they're passing through, they arise in relation to causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions will fragment, and something else will arise instead. It might be through training a feeling of compassion that arises after that. You know, so it's allowing yourself that space and that possibility of being able to examine habit patterns, because actually what you're going to see in the majority of cases is when you're sitting, when you're doing your mindfulness practice, when you're doing whatever the practice is in terms of silent sitting meditation practice, you are going to be familiarizing yourself with yourself. You know, and actually it becomes quite good fun after a while. You know, you see familiar friends. Oh God, there goes anxiety again. There goes misery. You know, and all in relationship to very specific, you'll find patterns to it. You'll find patterns to it. So again, it's a very practical teaching here. Now, immediately upon in dependence on the sankharas is going to arise consciousness. Because what are we conscious of? Well, mainly we're conscious of immediately, proximally, our habit patterns, because they're so strong. You know, my wants, my likes, my dislikes. You know, they're really, really strong, aren't they? I mean, when I said this about habit patterns, really, actually, a lot of them are about what I want and what I don't want. Even Freud recognised this. You know, he talked about something called the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle was about the avoidance of pain. You know, that's what the pleasure principle was. You know, I don't want this to happen. And so we again are conditioning ourselves to avoid certain things and go after certain things. And of course, if Kama Ashrava is one of the driving forces behind it, then we're going towards all those things which we like. All those nice little sensual goodies out in Western society, and we have lots of them, don't we? In fact, the whole of Western society is based on, well, actually, a couple of philosophers, French philosophers, actually talked about as producing desiring machines. You know, the whole...
Well, it relates to your point of the enormity of the task, because we're constantly bombarded and under that pressure from the media to be a certain way, to live a fast life, to be distracted. Yeah. And so, and when you're tired and you've worked a full day and all that sort of thing, often you think of, you know, and so it is a trick. And I mean, one of the ones right now that I have a great kick out of with my kids is mobile phones. Because, you know, 5 years ago, you know, you might have had one, or 10 years ago, whatever. And the kids are always on me now saying, Dad, why don't you have a mobile phone? We need to get in touch with you. So what happened 5 years ago when these things weren't around? How did we manage? Yes, that's right. Oh no, well, this is, you know, different. You must have a mobile phone. It's just amazing how hooked in to things we get. conditioned.
Yeah, we're conditioned to do it. Yeah, because it's also about things like identity and status and all sorts of other conditions that we're involved in. You know, I mean, basic street cred. Yeah, also with kids, but also for ourselves. You know, it's the way we buy into ideas of status and power and being somebody in this world, and that goes above ashra, being something in this world, being recognised, not being thought a Luddite. Yeah.
It's also the comfort zone as well, because if you haven't got your mobile phone, you've got to look for a phone box that's working. You've got to have the right money in your purse. And all these things may go wrong, and you're going to go, ooh.
Yeah.
But if you've got your mobile phone, you're in the comfort zone. You pick it up, as long as you've got charged up and you're paid. You can just do it. It's the comfort zone. We're looking even there for a comfort zone, aren't we?
I mean, having said that, there is nothing wrong with these things. It's the way that we allow them to appropriate us. Do you see how the way I'm putting it? We don't appropriate them, they appropriate us. We become slaves to them.
Yeah, and what Rosetta's saying is that what it compromises then in kids, and maybe in adults as well, but if kids are if it's so convenient just to pick up the phone and say, Dad, come and pick me up from here, or they get into a problem and they can't figure it out, well, what do I do here? I mean, it's sort of short-circuiting problem-solving skills, planning skills, things they need to survive.
Yes, yeah.
You know, it's...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. It's about delivering the world in a particular way, which is for my convenience. And actually, let's face it, a big part of living is about inconvenience. Things don't happen the way you want them to do, always. You can't always guarantee that something's going to fall in place because you want it to. Yeah. And that's the way it is. Now, okay, yes, there's nothing wrong with the mobile phone, but what when it breaks down? As they do, they go wrong, the networks go down, there's no signal. And all this sort of stuff that people complain about, all the time. Because then they're at a loss to know what to do.
Or then they get angry.
Or they get angry.
This O2 provider, there's no signal here. Let's have more maps.
Right.
I mean, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I was remember going down to, I'm just going to get an anecdote, so if you don't mind. I was going down, because I think it is very, very true. I was coming back from London after, I forget what I was going to. I went to SOAS in London, School of Oriental African Studies in London for some reason. And I was coming back on the coach. And there was a mother and daughter who were sitting side by side. And all through this journey, which was about 2.5 hours long, the mobile phone kept going on, and you could hear the words, "I'm on the coach. I'm on the coach. I'm on the coach." And there was not much else said during this. Actually, I really, really sort of applauded the mother, because after about the 15th time it had gone off like this, she leaned across to her daughter and said, "You have a very sad life, don't you?" Because again, I mean, something like that can seem like a substitute. For being the paucity of what goes on in terms of communication, despite the fact we have this communication implement, says it all, really. Yeah. So anyway, let's get to consciousness. Yeah, I said it was going to be quick, didn't I? Consciousness arises immediately on dependence on the sankharas. Sankharas arise and then consciousness arises.
What are sankharas?
Oh, sorry, it's habit formations. Yeah, karmic formations is what the technical translation. So consciousness, vijnana, arises because of its dependence on habits here. Now, it's very simple here. I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to get to the more important part. But consciousness in Buddhist thought is never alone. There is never such a thing, really, as pure consciousness. There is always consciousness of something. Even if awareness is aware of itself, it's aware of something. And so consciousness here, independent arising, is saying, what am I immediately conscious of? Usually in most moments, I'm full of all the stuff, and I'm not going to go through it all again, all of the stuff that's coming from avidya and passing through these habit formations. You know, that's why, in other words, I'm most immediately, often, let's just take a very simple one, which I gave you earlier on. I'm immediately conscious of my likes and dislikes, my preferences. Yeah. Yeah. Lights coming through, too strong, might be in your eyes. I can see you're sitting here a little bit. You know, might be a dislike. You're immediately conscious of an uncomfortableness, even if it's not fully coming to cognitive awareness here. So we're actually immediately conscious of our likes and dislikes here. So consciousness is arising there. Dependent on a consciousness arises namarupa, name and form. Now, often I think this gets totally misinterpreted even in traditional views. I had lots and lots of arguments with monks in Asia and stuff about this who go down a party line about this. Mind and form is not, name and form is not mind and body, as most people think it is. It's the way, if you like, of blueprinting mind and body. You know, it's the basic conditions which are set down, or dispositions which are set down for what is going to occur later on in the chain of dependent origination. So in other words, you think about it. You have a vidya, ignorance, which sets up your habit patterns, which is coming to consciousness, and both mind and body in this relationship is being, in a sense, determined in a particular way. So if I've set up physical habits, such as unwholesome physical habits, eating badly, smoking or drinking and things, eventually the body, which comes about in later age, is going to, in a sense, be determined by those patterns. Yeah? If I have a propensity to think in certain ways, in other words, setting up certain psychological dispositions, they are going to determine my later outcome in life, such as fear, anxiety, and talking about the negative stuff that goes on. So I am here at this moment with a whole set of dispositions, which is blueprinting what is going to come, isn't it? Yeah. So if you've got a mind in a particular way and certain physical habits in a particular way, they are going to determine what's going to come later on. It's as simple as that. You know, so they are the basic blueprints for what's occurring. Now, because that blueprinting isn't just occurring any old how, you know, that blueprinting will determine our 6 sense doors. You know, salayatana, our 6 sense doors. Obviously all the 5 normal ones, plus our mental sensing. You know, what we sense. So there's not a lot more to be said about that. So in other words, this is deterministic chain. I don't want to keep repeating the terms, but as you can see, what's going from avidya to from ignorance to formations to consciousness to blueprinting mind and body, which is determining actually what we see. Yeah, it determines what I see. It's remarkable without, you know, what I was stressing last night, without mindfulness, how inattentive we are. We simply let loads of things pass us by. Training in mindfulness is training in attention. Learning to train ourselves in attention. You know? And therefore we become aware of a vaster spectrum of life. You know, this is actually learning to live your life, rather than just let it happen. You know, kind of life happens. This is learning to pay attention to what is happening, that moment-to-moment awareness. Whereas there might be something arising which is negative or perceived as negative, but there's also arising something else. You know, it's like the half-empty, half-full thing. Determining on what the story is you're telling yourself. Depending on what story you're telling yourself about the phenomena that's occurring. But there is always something else happening, you know, which we're not aware of. You know, so training in attention is important. So in other words, we're coming to our senses a lot of the time, learning to come to our senses. You know, Fritz Perls, the Gestalt psychologist, had a wonderful phrase for it, which was losing your mind and coming to your senses. Because so much in sensory experience is normally just determined by conditioned habit patterns. That's all. You know, all our preferences. You can think about all, say, again, very simple things. All the prejudices people have against foods, and I'm not talking about having allergies and stuff like that, you know, physical conditions, but all of the ways, oh, I don't like that. Yeah. Have you ever tried it? No. Yes, that's right. You know, so there's all those ways that our sense patterns are, in a way, conditioned. You were conditioned to see certain things and like them, conditioned to see other things and not like them. And again, coming back to what you were saying, a lot of those are culturally conditioned too. Yeah. So,
Would you say then, if it's deterministic because of the way we behave, is it the same thing as fatalistic, in a sense that it is predetermined if you're behaving, if you're just going with life, whereas with mindfulness you're kind of cutting that?
your mindfulness, you're cutting it. Most definitely. That is exactly what mindfulness is determined. These things will be determined. It will be actually quite a strong form of determinism if you don't do anything about it, if you don't bring mindfulness to it. You know, that's what's happening. You know, because if you like, some of our habits we can recognise, can't we? Some of our habits we can recognise. In fact, as I say, point them out to you on occasion. Most of them we don't. Most of them. In fact, we think that, as I say, I was joking about it, I know, but we do think they are us. They're so deeply embedded in us. They're part of our world outlook, you know, our world view. So actually what we're really, really engaging in, and this is a wonderful task, please don't look miserable about it, a wonderful task of exploring all the elements of our conditioning. All of the elements of our conditioning. And it's only when we're not conditioned that there is freedom. Where there's conditioning, there's only reactivity. That is all. And so when you come to the next bit, dependent on, of course, salayatana, on the six sense conditions, then we have contact. You know, Buddhism makes it even clear in a way. Well, there weren't things around in these days like that, but you know, even if you were in sensory deprivation chambers, you know, you would still be contacting your mental stuff, you know, because all of that has a feeling tone to it. You know, so sparsha, phassa, is contact. We are contacting. You know, actually, we contact all the time, and part of mindfulness training is about our ways of contact. You know, I sit here and I'm aware of the pressure of my upper thighs and my buttocks on the chair. Not something I'm normally aware of. I've got to place mindfulness there, haven't I, to see it. I can be aware, for example, sitting in meditation, of the one hand resting in the other, the warmth of one hand. Something we're not normally aware of. Something we're generally quite aware of is we get pains. You know, they obtrude into our consciousness and then they make us move. So there's a tremendous range of just ordinary sensory experience which is taken down in mindfulness practice to which we pay attention. You know, most of us are not aware of our clothes touching our body. Yet they are. You know, we're always in contact and things are in contact with us. You know, our eyes palpate the world. They kind of literally massage it in a way. But it's a determined massaging. We massage it into what we want to see a lot of the time. You know those tricks, those kind of visual tricks that you see. You see you can see it as a beautiful young woman or a hideously old woman. You know, and you've got to alter your attention as to what you see. In a way, that's often what we see in the world, isn't it? We often are viewing the hideous old person, deliberately made to look so, whilst actually we could be viewing something completely different. Same world, different looking, different ways of seeing. Yeah. So, you know, that's kind of gestalt that you're operative in. You can't see both at the same time. Have you noticed that? You've got to switch your attention in order to do it. It says a lot about the human mind, you know. And some people literally cannot see the other figure enclosed within it. Yeah, some people literally cannot see the other figure. Can't switch their attention. So, then we get into the interesting stuff.
I think that's not interesting.
So, because out of contact arises Vedana. Vedana is feeling. Feeling. But as I always say, don't get sentimental on me or emotional, because feeling here is really a kind of bare sensation. It's a bare sensation. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Yeah. It's a bare sensation of something. So on contacting something, immediately it arises, in other words, in terms of a tone as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And that really covers the complete range of your experience. There's nothing else outside of that. So all of our experiences as a bare sensation, this is not thought. I don't think to myself, oh, I like the feeling of that. It's just, stick my hand on a hot plate, I experience it as unpleasant. Put my hand perhaps on a piece of velvet, and I experience it as a pleasant sensation. And an awful lot of the stuff, of course, we don't experience either way. In fact, you probably don't even notice it because you're not experiencing it either way. Now, that's not to say these remain fixed. I could turn into a masochist and really like the feeling of a hot plate. Did you ever see the Little Shop of Horrors? Have you ever seen that film? Do you remember the meeting between the sadistic dentist and the masochistic patient? It's a wonderful little sequence in there.
No anaesthetic, please.
That's right, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And he goes up to him with a pair of the pliers to pull out his teeth. He says, can't you make them bigger? That's right.
It's not hurting you.
Anyway, that's beside the point. But Vedana itself is something, in a sense, we don't have a choice about. Vedana is an automatic response to whatever situation arises, to whatever we're contacting, either through our sense organs or our mental sensing. So certain thoughts will arise and they have an unpleasant tone to them. Certain other thoughts will arise and have a pleasant tone, and an awful lot of them just don't have any feeling tone at all to them. They're just there. They're kind of the chunter that goes on. They're just a simple chuntering away that's happening. But what happens is the response to Vedana. That becomes the important part. It's the response to Vedana. And the response to Vedana is, of course, what is traditionally known as craving. The word in Pali and Sanskrit, the word in Pali is tanha, the word in Sanskrit is trishna. Like Krishna, but with a trishna, which means craving. It's actually desire, in a way, as much as anything else. It's desiring. And that might sound funny, because actually what we are desiring is the desire to avoid as well as the desire to have, isn't it? Again, it's something I briefly mentioned last night, I don't know if you remember. I said, we spend actually, majority of our life we probably spend trying to avoid things. If you actually think about it, we try to avoid all sorts of unpleasant things happening to us. We don't want, there's so much in this world that we don't want. And then whatever bits left over is we're desiring what we want. But, as you will notice, in desire, and it's the whole point about it, is that desire, in Buddhist terms, has no terminal point. It's the desire to desire to desire to desire to desire, and it has no end point. Think about it now, put this in very practical terms, in your own life. And again, it comes back to often the way things are sold in our societies, isn't it? They tell you, if only you had, you would be a contented person. A really happy individual. It's all the stuff of the advertising, of the ads, isn't it? If you had, well, at least until the next model comes out. And even if you've done this and bought into this in our own lives, for example, you might find yourself saying, look, if only I had, I'd be really happy. I'd be really content. I just only want that one thing in life and I'd be perfectly content. Might be win on the lottery. And joking aside, but a lot of people do. They hold out for this sort of stuff, don't they? Get themselves into debt and all sorts of things because of it. If only I won the lottery, I'd be happy. No chance. because it'd be then on to the next if only I had. You know? In other words, there is no terminal point for us. Even if we get the thing that we want, it does not create contentment. It does not create peace. You know? The mere possession of something doesn't fulfill craving. And let's use that strong sense of the term. I've talked about it as being desire, but does not fulfill craving. Because the actual word in Pali and Sanskrit, Trishna or Tanha, actually has the implication of an unquenchable thirst. You know, literally, it's a thirst you cannot quench by anything. You know, what it leads to, of course, this unquenchable desire or craving is, again, dis-ease. Isn't it? Everybody's feeling agitated because of what I haven't got. Oh, if only I had, I'd be happy. If only I was with somebody, I'd be happy. Yeah, if only I wasn't living here, I'd be happy. Yeah. As if it's a kind of commodity that comes from outside. You know, happiness is not a commodity that comes from outside, is it? It's something that is generated out of internal conditions. People in the most intolerable, in scare quotes, situations can be perfectly happy. In fact, that was one of my motivations in 1970 for getting involved in Buddhism, because I met all these Tibetan refugees up in Dharamsala who had literally just being shifted from another camp in India, and they were just settling Dharamsala. It wasn't really even properly inhabited at that time. And they were just settling that. They had nothing, they had hardly any places to live, and yet they were all walking around smiling and laughing. Yeah. Now, I don't want to over-romanticise Tibetan peoples, because the more you live with them, the more you discover that part of that is cultural as well. But it's also about, you know, over 1,000 years of Buddhism in Tibet, you know, 1,300 years of Buddhism in Tibet, you know, which has actually helped to create that culture, which is a culture more of, I wouldn't say totally, but more of a degree of contentment than we have in the West with our agitation and our drive towards material things, looking constantly for something outside ourselves to make us happy. You know? And often we do this, I mean, we make this demand on the world, basically, don't we? Go, make me happy. You know, we say this to the things of the world, we say it to other people. I'm not saying we literally say it, obviously, but then often that is what's implied in some relationships. You know, is the demand on the other to make me happy. You know, what a death knell, isn't it? You know, because they're not going to. Only you can create. I mean, the conditions for some degree of happiness can arise out of fruitful relationships, but it's not dependent on the other person. You know, it's not dependent on the other person. So out of, you know, let me backtrack a second. Conditions for happiness are generated from within. You know, so it's the dropping of craving. Now, craving is of three forms. There's the craving for sensual things, which we talked about, that relates right back to the very beginning. And I mean, I don't need to talk about that. That's all the stuff of our societies. You know, the craving for all the material objects, sensual pleasures, but it's also the craving for things like drink and drugs and, you know, you name it, all the stuff that goes on, all the abuses in our societies as well. It's ways of trying to make ourselves happy. You know, why do people get out of their heads? Because they think it's going to make them happy. They think they're going to have a good time. You know? And it usually is until they sober up. You know, there's accident emergency wards full of people who've been having good times. You know. Then there is, of course, something called bhava tanha, which again relates back to the ashravas. Do you remember? You know, when I said bhava, the desire to be something. Yeah, you want, just face it, on a really good day, the sun's shining, you get up, things are going your way for the day. You want it to remain like that, don't you? Yeah. You want it to go on those odd days when it's like that. You want it to continue. And it might even drive you into thinking, well, I'd like to continue forever. You know, or at least somehow ways of stabilising it and ways of being so these things continue. And in a way, that's partly what bhava Bhava Ashra is about. It's about ways of continuance, ways of being. Now, strictly speaking, in strict Buddhist philosophy and psychology, it also transmutes into the idea of the longing, the desire for something like an immutable self or soul which will carry on after your death. Now, that's the most extreme form. So it's idea of investment perhaps in the idea of a self which is indestructible. And in Indian culture at that time, there was a very strong idea of that. You know, the Brahmanical tradition, what we will now call the Hindu tradition, the Brahmanical traditions of that period talked about an indestructible self, which they called Atman, you know, which would continue. In texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, which some of you might have read or even delved into a little bit, or even have a little bit of knowledge of. In a text like the Bhagavad Gita, you find statements like this. Krishna is trying to persuade Arjuna to engage in fighting, because he's a warrior. And Krishna says to Arjuna, don't worry, Arjuna. If you think you kill others, or that you are killed yourself, then you are mistaken, because the Atman, the real self, is neither produced nor destroyed. It's immortal, it's eternal.
Isn't this taught in Buddhism? Isn't this
No.
taught in Tibetan Buddhism?
I mean, you can ask me questions about that later, but the quick answer is no, it's not. It's the very opposite of all that. There is something called rebirth that's taught in Buddhism, but it's not. But I'm not reborn. Something is reborn, but it's not me. It's not an immutable substance. Yeah, which makes it quite counterintuitive, and makes it very much much different from the Hindu Brahmanical idea. But Hindu Brahmanical idea is very easy. It's reincarnation. You take the one thing which is identical, and it takes up many, many different forms. Buddhism isn't like that. Buddha never taught that. Sometimes in my more scholarly research, I delve into this, and I don't think actually sometimes that the Buddha actually really even meant the idea of rebirth literally.
I'm glad you said that,
Yeah.
because this is what I also feel, I feel more comfortable.
Right. I know. I mean, this is the big problem. Of course, it can sometimes feel more comfortable for Westerners to do it, which is why I'm, in my more scholarly work, researching this very thoroughly. Because sometimes the Buddha did use rebirth in the earliest material as a metaphor for something. Yeah. But anyway, I think, you know, the point about it, and I think sometimes why perhaps he teaches it as a literal doctrine, is because it has a pragmatic effect. Yeah. That's why. Yeah, if nothing else, the Buddha is a pragmatist. He will tell you what you need to hear to get you to do something. Yeah. And if you're at the lowest strata of Indian society, which had a very strong notion of reincarnation, then he's teaching something which is palatable to them, but within a Buddhist framework with differences, slight differences being added to it. But I don't want to go into that because it's my more scholarly work. But Bhavatanha can be that idea, the idea of an immortal soul. It can be the ideas of wanting to perpetuate yourself, say, through your good works. You know, Andrew Carnegie always strikes me as there. You know, on virtually every library building in Britain, there's a little tablet to Andrew Carnegie, having given the money to, you know, found this particular thing. In academia, obviously, which is part of my work, not, you know, very little now actually in comparison. But in academia, we have all these chairs named after the people that endowed them. Yeah, like the Bowdoin Professor of Sanskrit. You know, Bowdoin was a particular man who endowed the chair in the 1850s. You know, his name goes on. It's the idea of trying to perpetuate yourself. You might want to perpetuate yourself through your children, living vicariously through them. That's another way of perpetuating yourself, you know, which we can do. It might even come down to, well, no, it's far less common than it used to be, down to the inscription on your tombstone. Yeah, it's another desire to perpetuate yourself, isn't it? Until they, you know, take up the bones and put them in the charnel house and and all the rest. I mean, I'm not being morbid here, I'm just saying what actually occurs. You know, some people come up with the most marvellous tombstones, don't they, to try and get them, you know, remembered. Yeah. I like W.C. Fields' one, that's one of my favourites. Yeah. Do you know W.C. Fields' tombstone?
Yeah.
I'd rather be in Baltimore.
I like it.
And the reason why he said that was because he hated Baltimore. Absolutely detested it. Okay, but being in Baltimore was preferable to being dead.
In Judaism they say you'll not die as long as someone remembers you.
Yes,
So you go every year to
Yeah.
the grave.
yeah, yes.
Nobody will remember.
But there's this desire to go on, isn't there, and perpetuate ourselves in some way. We want to be remembered. So it's all the desire to be still, even if we believe that death is the final end, even if we don't have any idea of anything continuing afterwards. There's the desire to want to still be of influence in this world in some way. Actually, it's all to remember, Spike Milligan's is also a good one. You must know Spike Milligan's. I told you I was ill. Oh, they do catch you and remember, make you remember them, don't they? Okay, that's you on a good day. I'll tell you on a bad day, then we'll have a break. You on a bad day is known as vibhava, which means the desire not to be at all. Now, we must have all at some point in our lives been through this. I know very few people. You know, it might be due to illness, those times when you really had the flu and, oh God, I don't want anything to do with the world, head goes under the blanket, turn over just when you can get out of bed. It's more serious, and I do mean this very seriously. The desire not to be can have very serious implications in terms of the desire for suicidal tendencies. You know, the desire not to be at all in this world, to obliterate oneself completely. Yeah. That's the very strong point about it. I don't want to go too much on to that because I think it's fairly obvious, and actually both of those, the desire to be and the desire not to be, fit very well if any of you know anything about Freudian psychology, because he has a notion of what's called the erotic drive, which is the desire to be, eros, and the desire for destruction, the death drive, thanatos, you know, the desire not to be. So it fits very, very well into a Freudian psychological background, this whole notion. Except just happened to do it 2,500 years earlier, that's all. Well, 2,400 years earlier, at the end of the 19th century. So, however, that is the three forms of craving. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. They're all mixed up. In fact, we can probably pass through most of that in a day. Yeah. When things are going well in this moment, then I want it to continue. When they're not going well, I just don't want to know. And sometimes, for example, our desire for sensual things can be an expression either of our life drive, our desire to be, or let's take something like excessive drug taking or drinking, can desire not to be, can't it? To blot oneself out, to obliterate oneself. There was a French philosopher called Georges Bataille, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him, but he talked about something very similar to this. He said, you know, that most people, when asked what they wanted to be in this world, said they, in a way, if they answered honestly, would want to be everything. And in being everything, you're nothing. Yeah, he said this was found in particular expressions in life, which was sexuality, intoxication and madness, as expressions of that desire. The desire to be everything and be nothing. And those are all part of the Bhavatanha as well. So in other words, you know, extreme sexuality, indulgence in sexuality of an extreme form, what they probably say sexual addiction these days, is an expression of the desire not to be. It's not about trying to get in contact with somebody, it's trying to lose yourself. You know, obviously madness, you know, extreme forms of madness is the complete, you know, thinks of forms of schizophrenia, whereas total, basically psychotic autism engaged in that, you know, where there's a complete loss of self, fragmentation of self. You know, madness another way, and intoxication is obvious. On that happy note, shall we have a break for 15 minutes? Does that sound okay? And then we'll do a 45-minute session up to lunch.